Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Schall, and I'm a project manager at Palantir.net. This is my first time presenting at a Drupal camp, and I have the honor of presenting with my colleague, as well as my husband, Ofer Schall, today, and we both reside in Boca Raton, Florida. Today, we are going to be talking about a virtual conference platform. Before we begin, Ofer, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Ofer Schall. I'm a senior front-end developer at Palantir.net. We have this very exciting topic, and here you go, Jennifer.
Thank you. So our client hosts an annual in-person conference every year that is extremely large in size. And the year 2020 was supposed to be extremely important for them because it was a year that attendees were seeking to understand and communicate critical information about the COVID-19 pandemic. During the course of the conference, usually attendees would learn about their tools, engage with a community of users, and get consultation and support from experts. When our client approached us, they asked about us creating a first-class virtual conference experience that would give the same value as an in-person conference. There were many things that were part of the requirements. I wanted to highlight a few of those. They wanted the online conference platform. They wanted the conference platform to be able to handle traffic of 100,000 attendees. This conference was supposed to span 3 days across 3 continents. They wanted it to be reusable, scalable, and to be able to use it for future conferences as well. They wanted a seamless, integrated experience that pulled content and services from multiple providers into a single platform. The timeline for this conference was 10 weeks, which was an extremely tight deadline. And Palantir's role was to be the technical lead. There were also multiple vendors who would be providing different services that were also taking part in the creation of this platform. As a project manager, I kind of felt like I was thrown a hot potato. Ofer, can you switch the slide? Yes. I was tasked with managing a number of internal teams, implementing and coordinating multiple vendors on tight deadlines. And the way that I did some of this work was by implementing a risk and decision log that we will talk about later on. Next slide. Team formation. So first of all, there were 20 Palantiris, teammates, that were going to work on this project simultaneously. We had to find a quick way with this tight deadline of 10 weeks to be able to assemble into teams and get started by hitting the ground running. We first organized the work by 4 different teams. We organized the work by epic, and that also included a customer success team. The people on the customer success team was myself, project manager, a product owner, and a project advocate. What we realized is that since we had these 4 teams operating, we needed a way to coordinate the work. We needed to establish communication across the teams. So we created a 5th team called the Team of Teams. This team was looking at the overarching work looking at overarching blockers, and met on a daily basis with 30-minute scrums to catch each other up on information that perhaps other teams were talking about that needed to be bubbled up. This team structure, we iterated on many times. At Palantir, usually our team sizes are about 6, so we don't have the need to change up the team and reallocate resources to different teams. But in this particular project, it was an interesting experiment in the sense that we did change the teams. We combined some of the teams and we changed the number of scrums and how many people were there to make sure that we had coverage, that we weren't missing any of the work that needed to be done. And it helped us to establish gaps and to make sure that we're taking care of those gaps. One tool that I did use, we had a lot of information. It was actually information overload. We had scrums to talk about this level of information. We had a tremendous number of meetings that took place between the different vendors involved, with the stakeholders. We had Slack communication going back and forth between teammates. So how do you process all this information? How do you surface what's important? Part of this project, it was 10 weeks, but when we came into the project as a technical lead, there was certain decisions that still hadn't been made. And we needed a quick way of figuring out what are those decisions and how do we capture when we've landed on what those decisions are. So this is a tool called the risk and decision log, and I want to talk a little bit about what it is and why we decided to use it. A risk doesn't always have to be a decision, and a decision doesn't always have to be a risk. They happen to sit in the same document, which is a Google Doc, but it was a place to capture information. We've discovered that in meetings with the client, there were often decisions that were talked about and sometimes landed on, but we found ourselves revisiting those decisions time and time again, perhaps because we didn't correctly capture the information, or because maybe one stakeholder missed a meeting and wasn't up to date on the latest decision that had been made. So we decided to use this method to be able to capture the decisions and the risks that were constantly taking place in meetings after meetings. This risk and decision log became a huge focal point for every meeting we had. The first thing we would do when we had a meeting with other vendors and stakeholders is, hey, let's pull up the risk and decision log and see what new risks or decisions have been logged. What decisions are still outstanding that we need to tackle? This became a living document. It was a collaborative document. It wasn't a document that was owned by just one person. It was a document that was used by Palantir. It was a document used by our vendors, and it was a document used by the stakeholders as well. I'd like to show you an example of the risk log and the decision log and talk you through how we would use it. First, we're going to look at the decision log, and we would first record a date, and I put an example here that we could just talk through. So we would log the decision of when the date was, when the decision was made, followed by what the decision was. In this example, the decision that was in question is, should we support IE 11? Followed by the priority level, which could range from low, medium, high to blocker. Followed by who made the decision. This was important to capture so we could, when we look back on this decision, we'd be like, there would be a shared understanding of who made that. Was it a team? Was it an individual? Or was it a committee? Thank you. We'd also assign a decision maker if there was one to be assigned, followed by the date that we needed a decision by. This was crucial for our project since we had a very tight deadline of 10 weeks. We needed to have decisions made as quickly as possible so that we could move forward with the work that needed to be completed. We would give further details. In this example, we stated that IE11 was only used by 3% of the users. This was important to know when making the decision, followed by the impact of the decision. This decision impacts the scope and the timeline of this project. Supporting IE will add 50 additional hours of development. It's important to know the impact so that we could revisit this later on to understand like what were the parameters around this decision. Once the decision was made, if we go back a couple slides, there's a confirm button, checkbox actually, that we would check off, and that whole line would be green. And this would show that everybody was in alignment about this decision. Everybody had the same shared understanding about what the decision is, why we made it, and what is the impact of this decision. And this document, this decision log, helped us to narrow down the scope as well. Next, we are going to talk about the risk log. A lot of times in meetings, I would find myself in the past writing a notes document summarizing the meeting where we'd outline the risks. But it was nice to have it in this shared Google Doc that was presented in the beginning of each meeting. We had many risks, especially with all the constraints and working with multiple vendors and working with complicated technology, that we needed to constantly keep our stakeholders aware and informed of these risks. So once again, we would record when the risk was logged, followed by categories. We had technical complexity, scope, and timeline. Now, these categories can be changed based on your project and what your needs are. And that's what's great about this document. We actually, for this particular project, changed some of the items on the risk and decision log to fit our needs. We would identify what is the risk. In this example, it's that we didn't have API access and the project could not be completed. And then you would list, once again, the impact of this risk. Is it high, low, medium? Is it a blocker? We would always list who identified the risk. Was it a client? Was it a vendor? What are the consequences of this risk? We like to use an if-then statement. This affects the timeline and the budget. This affects the timeline and the budget. A mitigation plan. So the mitigation plan in this situation was we will create dummy data to be replaced with real data from API at a later date, as well as additional comments. You don't have to fill this in, but we found this useful. We recorded a little bit of the history of the API, that we were waiting on access already for 3 weeks. And this request is currently with the IT department. So this framework gave us the ability, once again, to be able to capture all the decisions and risks, to surface the risks and decisions in the beginning of every meeting, keeping this as a living document that was collaborative, that limited the scope, that kept an eye on risks. It was really the focal point. It became the focal point of all our meetings. I would highly recommend to try to use this. It could be on a project of any size. I found it has been very valuable in projects that I run as a project manager. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now we're transitioning into the engineering part of the project. By the way, anyone has a question, we have a chat open through Zoom. So if you have some questions, you can type your questions right there in the chat. We'll have also time dedicated at the end of this piece of the presentation. So this, as Jennifer mentioned, is a challenging, big project. And here I'm going to overview some of the engineering concepts. Basically, as you know from the title, Vue was one of the things that helped us. We're going to talk about how Drupal and why Drupal was chosen as well, and how we were able to achieve all what we wanted to. Everything was performing, and it ended up being a flawless event with everyone, vendors, clients, very happy with the results. So what were the technical challenges that we had to face? We have a bunch of them. Performance. This is a virtual conference. Virtual conference usually has registration. And registration means now we need to know individuals. We need to differentiate between anonymous user or registered user. And not only we had registered users, we had 3 types of users that we need to identify as well. If you're familiar with Drupal performance, Drupal works great with anonymous users, but once we talked about logged in users, this is much more challenging. And facing the numbers that we're talking about here, creating regular sessions for logged in users of Drupal, as easy as it is to implement the backend, the actual performance gonna fail very, very quickly with extremely robust servers. And I don't know if anyone tried that before. So beside Drupal.org, that has its own tools. But otherwise, with the timeline that we have and what we needed, that was one of the big issues, big challenges that we had to deal with. Privacy was extremely important for the client. Privacy issues were making sure that no user can be identified on the server, no user details can be identified on the server. Because of privacy concern, everything would happen, the actual logging in should happen with a third party and later on come to the actual virtual conference site. Among privacy issues, we also had the issue of we were not able to add any third-party vendor we want to use for different technology solutions because that would take a long time in the process, and we only had now less than 10 weeks to finish this. Even though we were using Drupal, and Drupal, by the way, was a requirement of the client, they use Drupal and like it and want to keep it in their technology toolbox, but content was not provided by Drupal. Content had to come from a third party. So putting this all together, how did we approach this and what did we actually create? To save the day, we chose Vue. And we chose Vue for multiple reasons. We utilized a module called PDB Vue. There's one module called PDB. There's another module called PDB Vue that is in addition to that. And in a nutshell, what that module allows you to do is create, through a simple YAML file, Drupal blocks. These Drupal blocks would load a script of Vue. So now think of how instead of fully decoupled websites, you can use Drupal theme, a regular Drupal website. And on top of that, you choose where and how to implement these various blocks. Each block is a Vue component, does something. It's a functionality, it's a display, but eventually this would be the full experience for the users. So PDB Vue allows me to connect a script of Vue, a JavaScript Vue file, and implement it in a Drupal block. Vue help us with performance and privacy because what we're able to do is keep using Drupal to manage different things, and soon you'll see more of what Drupal had to do in the scheme of things. But from Drupal point of view, Drupal only dealt with anonymous users. Unless someone actually had to go in and edit something in Drupal, because a few pieces were there, all users, tens of thousands of users, were all anonymous users. So that combined with CDN, that was like an easy job for the servers. We were preparing a lot of servers for that, but the end result was like all the servers were nice and quiet, even in the busiest times. By the way, I don't know if we mentioned that earlier, the whole conference was across 3 continents. So we had content being displayed all the time. It was chunks of 8 hours according to the timeline of America, Europe, and Asia. While Drupal was dealing with anonymous users, Vue was doing all the hard work of authorizing the user and bringing in content. Another advantage of Vue, within the conference, there were hundreds of sessions and on-demand content that people could choose from. And we utilize a really nice library called items.js. It is not related to Vue at all, but it's a JavaScript library that allows you to create search in complex JSON structures. They recommend up to 1,000 items. So we were in about 500. So we were really good, very performant. It works great. A very big advantage of Vue. Maybe I'll try to reload this screen. Here we go. Vue is very easy to learn. We had a group of developers that were really good at front end and Drupal and Twig, and JavaScript, but not many of them had Vue experience. So here I'm showing you an example. If you know Twig, you'll be familiar with some pieces of it. A Vue component would usually look like this, and this is a Hello World component. It has a template on top, it has a JavaScript in the middle, and it has CSS at the bottom. Our CSS, by the way, for the project was built by a style guide. So the style guide created all the CSS we needed, and by having class names in the HTML, and Vue code looks very similar to Twig and HTML. So the developers that do not have experience with Vue come to a code like this and know that they need to usually concentrate in a template and displaying things. They understand that greeting is a variable, just like in Twig, and Vue will take care of that. We're able to get some information from Drupal, but most of it was getting JSON data, as we're going to see very soon. So here's how, yeah.
You have a question.
Okay.
Does the search happen client side or server side?
Great question. Client side. So our client's browsers were doing most of the work. The server was doing very, very little, was sending some information when needed, but the clients, the items.js that I showed before, it is a full client-side search engine. And that's why it's super performant, doesn't bother the server. You start typing a word, it already find the session that you want. The general flow that we chose to work with was basically when you load a Drupal page, really it's almost an empty page. The first thing that is being loaded, beside like a background color probably, is the menu. So when a user go to the virtual conference website, the first and only component Drupal actually calls for is the menu. The menu finds out, is this user authorized? After going to that third-party authorization, Vue was able to check, is this user allowed to see content as a registered user or not? Or if this is a registered user, what type of user and what type of content are we going to provide? Once the menu component made that analysis, the menu load the correct menu according to what the person needs to see, and then the menu component was calling all the rest of the component of the page. So if you would look at the HTML of each page of the conference, it's almost empty. But all these things happen in milliseconds. The user wouldn't see that, oh, now content is loading. It looks like a regular page being loaded, fully cached. But the flow itself is the menus loading first, understand what needs to be displayed, and immediately display all the other Vue components with their content. The way we use PDB Vue, as I mentioned, that's a module. It creates for us blocks. All we need to do is fill out a very simple YAML file that says, here's the name of the view, here's the name of the block it creates, and we can add any additional JavaScript libraries. Another advantage of Vue is you do not have to compile anything. You could use Vue as is, especially with PDB Vue. The code itself does not need to be compiled and it runs. By the way, that website did support i11. As we go through the project, we realize that the content that needs to come from a third party would come from a third party, but once we access it too many times, and it wasn't many, immediately the API just doesn't work. The server fails, it goes timeout. And in order to solve that, now that we have Drupal, and we definitely know how to use Drupal, we end up having Drupal fetching twice a day the API, bringing all that content into JSON structure that is being saved in Drupal. And we kept it JSON structure because we didn't need to translate it into Drupal fields. We didn't need to save any of that. So the content that would come from third party was saved as it comes in JSON object. These JSON objects would go to Vue to be consumed and being displayed. So here Drupal helped us by basically being the base platform of everything runs on, and allowing us adding specific pages that are needed because of how Drupal is flexible and allow us to create content type if we need. But while keeping all the main content coming from external sources, being updated twice a day, the tens of thousands of users that use the site during the 3-day sessions were actually getting the JSON that was saved in Drupal. Things that we're going to do differently in the future. I would highly recommend making sure that API performance is as promised, meaning that when we came to work on this project, we just, we thought, okay, content gonna come, it's all good. We have another project now where we have certain assumptions about the API. So as soon as you can make sure these assumptions are correct, that you can test it and see that it works the way it's supposed to, the better. We're happy to have Drupal to save us, being able to fetch everything through Drupal, save it there, and work from there. The next thing we would do, which we're already implementing in other projects, is using shared components. So even that these Vue blocks are separate, there is a structure that we implement that allow us to share components. So a lot of the functionality we needed had to do with time, because we dealt with 3 different time zones in the same conference. Each user had to be identified with their own time zone and change different things accordingly. Shared components simply means that if something is used in more than one component, we just keep using that shared component. So all that shared component is compiled and each Vue block can call it. The other improvement we're going to do is utilizing web components. Today, we're using PatternLab to create style guide so the client can see before the whole site is ready how page is going to look like. That style guide help us create the CSS that we're consuming using the actual website. But any component that was created in the style guide had to be recreated manually in Vue, because Vue does not read Twig right now in a simple way, and PatternLab is using Twig to create the components. Creating this with web components would allow us to create a style guide with a component and that component as is going to be utilized inside Vue. Now we have some time for questions. Here's some ways you could contact us if you want to ask more of whatever we wouldn't be able to cover today. We have our emails, our Drupal users, and for me, you can also find me on Drupal Slack on Twitter with the same username. And now we can look in the chat and see some questions.
Oprah, we're at the question from Sean.
Okay.
If
One
maybe you
question
would
here. Could you simply have used curl to update a static JSON file via cron? Did Drupal add much development overhead for this? It's a good question, mainly because I don't remember so much about the backend. I think that that content had to be authorized and have special access. So it's not anyone who curl that third-party content would just fetch information. There was a whole process of authorization, making sure we're allowed to fetch that content and get that special content, and that's how Drupal added. I don't think it was a big overhead because, yeah, at the bottom line, it was bring that content, and the decision not to put it inside Drupal field and later on take Drupal field and let Vue use them, but it comes as an object from the third party. Let's keep it as a JSON object. Question from Nicholas. How exactly did you use Drupal to cache the third-party API? Was it mainly to migrate module or was it a custom? Cache third-party API. I think that was, if I understand the question correctly, we created that code ourselves. We didn't use any migrate tool that would just fetch things for us. And yeah, so there was a custom module bringing content, saving it as JSON. That's how it was done. Yeah. Do we have additional questions? You can write in the chat. I don't know if it's possible to open video and audio, but that's another way you could do it. Can share also. Yes, sir. Sorry, Jennifer.
No, I just wanted to share one thing that we didn't talk about was that this conference was really flawless. So it was a great success. The client was extremely happy with the outcome. The attendees were extremely happy with the outcome. So it was very performant, and we didn't have any major obstacles during the course of the 3 days.
Yeah, it seems like the planning work that we did was sufficient. Yeah, and it was interesting and challenging working with a big group of people internally, working with other vendors we did not work before to receive things that usually we might take care of internally, like design that happens externally. One of the processes that helped us also was working with external designers. I guess our designers already know pretty much how we do things and able to aim things according to the time that is available for us. Working with external design team that felt very creative, we had to tell them where things are way too complex. And with the time constraints we have, that's the only reason. It's not that things technically are not possible. The question always is it possible to make it in time? Because this deadline of that conference is happening on that day, and that definitely is not moving anywhere. So being able to identify things that might be too complex or have so much complexity and maybe not so much benefit, I guess creating MVPs as soon as possible and understanding, even if we have this, and that ready, that will be good for us. Working on the mobile display was also a bit challenging because of how things look in mobile. I think we had to work on a lot of the mobile stuff additions. One of the features we add, I mentioned the search engine that was there, that was all client side. The other one was the display of the actual conference. I think we had 4 different tracks for regular users plus 2 other tracks for other users. And these 4 tracks were displaying the timeline of what happens in which category that session is on. Plus, we added, that was like nice to have, but really, I think, helpful when we were able to add it. There was a ticker, a line that would show you where we are in that time. And as we go, it would show it. Also in the search, we're able to display what's the time of the day and which time zone would you like to filter by, because you could see things that are also not only in your time zone. And that line would allow you to see where things are at and what's coming ahead. We took advantage of cookies in the part of, so think about 500 sessions, and we can't use third-party solutions to save information because of all the privacy I mentioned. What we end up doing was creating a page of, within the search engine that we have, you could add a session to watch list. So you could choose whether these are live sessions or just on-demand sessions from before. And these sessions would be saved on your machine using cookies. And every time you would go there on check what's next and what's in my watch list, you would be able to view that list and get there quickly and navigate a little easier between 500 different options. We have another question from Nicholas. Did you use any tools like Sentry.io to monitor client-side issues, errors, since most of the activity was on the client side? We did not use Sentry.io. We did use, was it the New Relic? Yeah, I think it was a New Relic. And yeah, usually we saw that we did our own testing. They had a very busy and active social team, and across all that, we didn't encounter anything. I think by being able to create a solution that works in i11, like, the rest is easy. i11 was a big addition to the work we had to do, because i11 doesn't like certain things in more modern JavaScript. Different thing like promises, if you're familiar with it, and getting response from data that come from another place. i11 need its own CSS. And also, what I didn't know before is when i11 has certain errors, the whole page can stop from loading. It's not that thing that errored out wouldn't work or function. Just i11 just have an error, you get a white page. So on one hand, it was easier to see there must be a problem here, but it is extremely difficult to debug, like, why did i11 not like it? And yeah, so just like we were familiar with the dev tools of modern browsers, i11 does have some sort of a version of that. It's not as amazing as what you would get in Firefox and Chrome and Edge, but at least it was helping us doing that. One more lesson I would like to share specifically about Vue, using objects coming from another place. We end up using vif. Vif is the way of Vue to check an if question, to check if that object or the children of that object already exist. By adding that vif, we never faced Vue trying to display null objects. So if you have an example like that, where you're trying to display complex objects on the screen and Vue just doesn't like it, a very simple solution is adding that vif, check if these children already exist and not null, Vue is dynamic, so as soon as it's possible, Vue would show you. And I think now we're at time, and we want to just mention tomorrow we have a contribution day, Saturday, February 20 from 12 to 3:30. We will have first time contributor workshop, mentored contribution, general contribution, and we can find it in the Slack channel of Drupal called Drupal Contributions. I personally highly recommend contribution days. That's how I learned so much. That's how I started my journey in contributing to Drupal and become a Drupal core maintainer. It all happened through Florida Drupal Camp, actually. Thank you, Mike Herschel. And we're gonna have some planned workshop, first time contributor workshop, introduction to merge requests, which is amazing. I tested that a few times now, mentored tooling, and we have some initiatives we're gonna work on. This is the Olivero theme, Simply Test, and Drupal recipes. Thank you so much for coming to our session. I think we're gonna keep this page and session live, and we appreciate you coming to our presentation. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you so much.